So without further ado, I'll introduce myself. I'm Misha Conman-Taylor. I'm professor of language and literacy education at the University of Georgia. I have a kind of hybrid identity here. I got my PhD in educational linguistics along with an MFA in poetry writing from New England College, and Jo Beth was there when I arrived, and I put my chapbook of poems and the dissertation in her hands, and they said okay, and I couldn't believe it. So it was really lovely to have a hybrid identity of artist and social science scholar welcomed at the University of Georgia, and has been a place for me to grow and nurture others who find themselves in between disciplines and languages and countries and other kinds of things like that. So I want to introduce you to our poets tonight. They are married and in the same room. So if you're not sure who they are, you can look and see two people, the only two people in the same space. They are coming to us from Asheville, North Carolina, which is exquisite. And I just learned that they are recently co-authoring a book, Write It, 100 Poetry Prompts to Inspire. I have to say I snuck a peek when I saw that, and the prompts are fantastic. So if you want to continue with the invitations to writing, I highly recommend you check out that new book from Penguin Random House and Spruce Books. So we have with us these two marvelous humans, Nicole Brown and Jessica Jacobs. Nicole Brown received her MFA from Vermont College, studied literature at Oxford University, and was, get this, the editorial assistant for the late Hunter S. Thompson. Oh my God, I want to have a separate conversation about that. She worked at Sarabande Books, which I just love, for 10 years. She's the author of Sister, which was published in 2007 and was reissued because of its awesomeness in 2018. Her second book, Fanny Says from BOA, won the Weatherford Award for Appalachian Poetry in 2015 and now has an audiobook, so you can hear her beautiful voice reading it. She teaches now at Sewanee School of Letters MFA program and the Great Smokies Writing Program at UNCA. She volunteers at 3 different animal sanctuaries, and that informs this book that all of us, many of us here have just devoured. And it's a chapbook called To Those Who Are Our First Gods, and it won the 2018 Rattle Chapbook Prize, and a long sequence called The Donkey Elegies, which was published as a chapbook by Sibling Rivalry Press just this year, 2020. And we also, she's going to duo read with Jessica, and Jessica Jacobs is the author of Take Me With You, Wherever You're Going, from Four Way Books, one of Library Journal's best poetry books of the year. It was winner of the Goldie Award in Poetry from the Golden Crown Literary Society, and it was a finalist for both the Brockman Campbell and Julie Sook, I think it's called, Book Awards. Her debut collection, Pelvis with a Distance, from White Pine Press, is a biography in poems of the great artist Georgia O'Keeffe, and it won the New Mexico Book Award in Poetry and was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award and the Julie Sook Award. She is an avid long-distance runner, and she's worked as a rock climbing instructor, a bartender, a professor, and now serves as chapbook editor for the Beloit Poetry Journal. She's currently at work on parallel collections of essays and poems exploring spirituality, Torah, and Midrash. And without, oh, look at all these wonderful people that are in the room. I wasn't looking at you. I'm so happy to see everybody here. I want you to welcome you to, I want you to encourage you to stay muted right now. But this is an interactive reading. If you have a question, this is a place where there's no dumb question. There are many people in here who are very experienced writers, and there are others who are novices and just beginning, and any question is welcome. So you can use the chat, and I'll try to keep track of those questions and draw our poets' attention to them, or at least by writing them, that might help us all see what your mind is thinking. And there may be spots in between the readings when we can ask and answer questions, and certainly after. The reading will take place in batches between the two poets, and we should hear lovely poems and then have some time for Q&A afterwards. So without further ado, if everyone would join me in an ASL applause, which is like this. Let's bring up our two poets, Jessica and Nicole. Woo!
Thank you so much. I think Jessica's going to start, but I just want to thank you for that really warm welcome. Absolutely lovely.
Yeah, and it was so lovely to meet you all before the reading began as well. So,
yeah,
and we're excited to hear your questions.
Yeah, and we're sharing a headset.
Oh, you can keep.
Oh, no, you can be in stereo.
Oh, okay. Hi. All right, so I'm Jessica, and per request, I'm actually going to begin with some poems from my first book. So to do that, because they're largely ekphrastic, which means they are poems that speak to a work of art in some way. They ask for a response from that work of art, and then hopefully it turns into a poem. I'm going to share my screen so you can see what I was responding to. All right, could I have like a thumbs up if y'all can see that? All right, fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to be reading to you from Pelvis with Distance, and that is the very beautiful throat and clavicle of the artist Georgia O'Keeffe. This is also Georgia O'Keeffe in 1917 when she was 29. This photo and the one on the cover were actually taken by the man that she ended up marrying, with his little bristle brush mustache, Alfred Stieglitz. And they had met several years before these photos were taken, when she was only 21 years old and she was an art student. And he was already a world-renowned photographer. He owned a gallery in New York. He was the publisher of a very famous art magazine. And she was just immediately taken with him despite the difference in their age. And they began corresponding. And at first, that correspondence was very formal, you know, Mr. Stieglitz, Miss O'Keeffe. But very quickly, especially once she left for Texas and there was some space between them, the letters became much more personal. So he would write to her about how he would visit his family's home on the lake and he would go swimming naked, which in 1917 was like super racy. But O'Keeffe was not someone to be outdone. So she responded with this. Nude Series 8, O'Keeffe to Stieglitz, Canyon, Texas to New York, New York. Naked swimmer, I am your blue lake, a hot moon lifting from my throat. Tonight, I am full of wheels and empty canyons. Desert so open we walk without roads. I throw bottles at the maid to order stars for my sister's rifle to spark, break, burst glass to belated sunset. The sheet on my bed is a great twist. It is strange to write you just because I want to, but I hate to be undone by a little thing like distance. So as you might imagine, those letters had quite an effect on Mr. Stieglitz, and he ended up bringing her to New York, and their very first poem, I guess a date is like a poem, their very first date, their formal date was at Coney Island, and so this is the Coney Island in the early 1900s, and I know some of you spoke about the joy of kind of working in between genres. And it was really a great deal of fun to do research on what Coney Island was like at that time, especially because Coney Island very famously burned down several times and had to be entirely rebuilt. So it took a lot of research to figure out like what was actually happening at that time, what structures existed. And I'm not sure if my dad managed to make the Zoom, but he said he was going to be here, and he suggested that I read this poem because he said that college students would identify with the feelings of a date. So this poem was is from my dad at his suggestion. Oh, and the poem mentions Decoration Day, which was the original name for Memorial Day. Coney Island, 1917. 2,000 miles from Texas, this is less an island than Brooklyn, dipping a prim toe into the grime of Gravesend Bay. It is Decoration Day, bunting and ticker tape black-suited bathers creaking the boardwalk. Inland, we stroll the midway, where grease rides the air as ochre foam rhymes the water. There is the tune and hitch of player pianos, penny arcades, barkers touting the ring toss, the high striker. 2 wallops for a nickel, 5 for a dime, win a Cupid doll for your cutie pie, an armadillo basket for her arm. Alfred offers his arm instead. His fingers notch, my fingers notch in his elbow. The sky turns cobalt threaded with ivory. Sun full on my face with the heat, something surfaces. We walk, I listen, I talk when seems called for, but all the while it rests in my chest. Not love exactly, not yet, but wanting, purely felt. He touches my shoulder, steers me to the moment the diving coaster car meets its shadow, and my ribs compress around breath, forming what? I am back in Texas, a canvas collecting sack near to tearing with chalcedony eggs whose outer plainness belied inner holdings. Manganese, copper, chromium, quartz. The secret to geodes, though, is to break them. Otherwise, fused crucible, hollow repository. I watch his mouth, but do not hear what he's saying. And the first time my dad read that, well before it was in a book, he looked at me with like a huge blush on his face and said, "Is that about sex?" And I was, so I'll let you all decide what it was about. And I'm just going to read one more poem from this book that's actually in my voice. So I had lived in New York when I was writing these poems right before graduate school. But most of O'Keeffe's later life was spent in the deserts, the high desert of New Mexico. And I had passed through there, but I didn't know it well. And like Nicole, and she might talk about this, I very much feel when I'm writing that I need to have an embodied experience of a place to be able to truly write it and have that place come to life on the page. So I took a little road trip. That's my dog, Rocco. So Rocco and I headed out to the high desert, and I found this tiny little primitive cabin. There was no electricity, no indoor plumbing, no internet, and no cell phone. So it was an amazing place to write. I ended up actually finishing my book there, writing a poem a day. But it was also really isolated. The next closest people were 5 miles away by foot. I didn't have a car. So it was amazing and terrifying. In the canyon too, fear breaking. Sun lavas over the cliff lip into my first full canyon day while I watch from the marsh of residual night. When put in touch with the priest who'd lived here for each of the last 3 Octobers, I'd written to ask how much food to bring, what other supplies. She'd replied with 2 questions. What is your experience with solitude? How are you girding yourself for this time? At a sound like a Cessna, I turn to see only a hummingbird. Pressure builds in my chest. I felt this before, but only when confined in a cave's crawl length in a crowded tent. But here, nothing but space, but air, for me, for a month alone. Knowing the root of anxiety is anxere, to be without breath. I inhale, I try, but breath is a strangler fig, a rib cage tourniquet. My hands and feet grow honeycombed, carbonated. The dog barks at something only he can see. I ache for a return to bed, for the child's comfort of sheets overhead. If I can't see this day, it can't see me. Rifling books at random, I find God at creation poured light into vessels. Unable to contain it, they shattered and fell. Tikkun olam. Jews gather these shards to repair the world. But there was a second shattering, a second type of repair. Tikkun hanafesh, repair of the soul. Inherent in brokenness is breaking open, the ability to hold more than when whole. How much will I hold when this is over? Thank you. So some of the things that I came to hold during that very long month in the desert was that I had really messed up because I had met this beautiful poet from Kentucky and screwed things up royally, and I needed to figure that out. And so much of the rest of Pelvis with Distance is actually about the speaker trying to make amends with the poet. And which brings me to a few poems from my second book, Take Me With You Wherever You're Going, which is poems about the first few years of marriage to that poet who might be sitting right next to me. So I'm gonna stop sharing. Oops. All right. Hello. Okay. So I'm gonna just read a few poems from here, and because that wonderful poet was kind enough to finally love me back, I figured it's worth writing an ode about. And as you'll see when she's reading, my girl has awesome hair. So I thought I would write a poem in celebration. So this poem begins with a quote by Pablo Neruda. Other lovers want to live with particular eyes. I only want to be your stylist. Curly, my tangler. Who needs Rumpelstiltskin when such treasure abounds? Her gold woven around my bike gears, tangled in my toothbrush, vining every drain, even sometimes found in my mouth upon waking. And just this morning from the bathroom, she called me in. My mama's the only one who ever brushed out my hair, she said, but you're my wife. You should know. I began at the bottom, her curls separating with the thick sound of good cloth tearing. Do you see why I had no friends when I was little? She asked. Mama brushed out my hair each day before school. I eased my fingers for the first time all the way through, asked how that felt for her. Vulnerable, she said. Shimmering out beneath the overhead light, a climbing of kudzu, a symphony of trumpet vines. Her hair revealed itself. It was like Velcro, she said. Anything would stick in it. Bubblegum, spit wads, pencils. I'd come home crying, and Mama would hold my ugly frizzy head and say, baby, they're just jealous, as though her love could make the lie so. When it comes to her, her mother and I have this kind of love in common. Only now the lie has come to pass. My wife, whose hair is the shade of farm fresh yolks, the color of things rich on the tongue, whose hair sings the plaintive song of bed springs, whose hair is the drifting smoke from a village of chimneys, corkscrews enough for 1,000 bottles of wine. A ski slope of S-curves, a grove of twirling maple keys, every playground slide worth sliding. Before a rapt audience, a company of ballerinas cambers their hands to trace out in the air your hair, my dear Angora goat, my cloud of bats spiraling from the cave. And that's one of the joys of being a poet, is that working, thank you all, that working is sitting on a couch for a whole day just thinking about like twisty things. So, but sadly, life and love cannot be all awesome hair. And one of the things that has really surprised me about marriage is that I have discovered that in my mind, and I'm sure this is just me, but I am amazing, like superhero, you know, just like doing great things all the time. I just got pushed. And what I was going to say, my darling wife, is that what marriage has done for me in an actually very helpful way is having someone there to witness you day in and day out. Makes it clear the ways that I've often fallen short of that vision of not just who I am, but who I want to be. A question to ask once the honeymoon is over. Big around as my bike helmet and high as my ankle. The box turtle was halfway from my side of the road to the other. The warm sun felt delicious, my legs strong, and it was almost to the center line. I hadn't been passed by a car for miles, so figuring if it was still there, I'd pick it up on the way back. I cycled past. Years before, the woman across the street was shaped like that turtle, or more like a toadstool, really, squat bell of a body atop the thin stalks of her legs, milky and bare beneath her frayed black house dress. It hurt her to move, clear even from my second-story window. So she brought her trash out in increments, in small, bursting grocery bags. She tossed each out the door onto the porch, then nudged them one step to the next before easing carefully, painfully, herself down, a step at a time. Then she towed them finally, slowly, into a crumpled heap at the curb. I left my window to help, then took her trash out every week after. That story. I hadn't yet told it to my wife, had I? But there was the turnaround quicker than expected, and I spun to find a beat-down bus trailed by all the fuming cars that hadn't passed me. Steadying my handlebars against the wind, I rode back hard, dodging around crushed squirrels and tire-splayed birds. The turtle was just where I'd left it, but with the top of its shell torn away. The dead turtle, a raw red bowl, its blood slashing the twinned yellow lines into an unequal sign, as in A is unequal to B, as in thinking about doing the right thing is not the same as doing it. As in how many times did I watch that old woman shuffle bags down the stairs, really how many, before I went from watching to helping. As in with my wife beside me, I am the woman who does not hesitate to lay down her bike and give a small life safe passage. As in, I bike slowly home, told no one. As in, will she love me less when she learns I am not equal to the person I am when she is watching? So I'm going to end there, just in the interest of time, and hand it over to the wonderful person who has been watching.
High tech around here, guys. So I had a set plan, but after listening to your introductions, I changed my mind. One of the things that struck me is how many of you are teaching language, teaching English as a second language, teaching literacy, and that's something that is very dear to my heart. I used to teach ESL to Vietnamese students in my early 20s, but more so than that, I grew up speaking a different kind of language. I know that sounds really odd, but I was raised by my grandmother from Kentucky, and she had a pretty thick accent. And what was so interesting to me growing up is that I thought if I wanted to be a poet, that I had to strip myself of everything that I was, that I had to scrub my tongue of the words that I knew and the way that I knew to pronounce words and elevate myself to poetry. And what happened, of course, is what happens to a lot of people. They leave their home, they get really far from it, and then they just turn right back around because a tree really can't survive without its roots. That said, my second book is all about my grandmother. It's about her life, her children, her way of speaking. I should let you know she did cuss like a soldier, so I'm just going to apologize in advance. I can't even, this is the great thing about Zoom, I have no idea, I can't even look around and know how y'all feeling about that. But I didn't want her to disappear. She died in 2004, but along with her, I've seen is her way of being, her way of speaking is also dying. Some of that, it was time to go, right? Some of her racism, some of the difficult things about her, but there was a lot about her that I loved, and I wanted to preserve it in a book. So this is why the book is pink. It is called Fanny Says. Thank you. And I'm going to read just a handful of poems called Fanny Linguistics. Her name was Fanny. So Fanny Linguistics, and they all start Fanny Linguistics, and then they have a subtitle. So Fanny Linguistics Malapropisms. And it starts with an epigraph that says, a language is a dialect with an army and navy. Unpack Chester drawers to find chest of drawers. Tandelon to find Tylenol, furl to foil, gazebo pills to placebo, salmonella candles to citronella. And when the cousin who shoots frogs out of the trees with a pellet gun graduates first in class, congratulate him not for being valedictorian, but for being crowned Victoria. Never drop the friendly S in anyways. And when Monroe belts out in the pines at full vibrato from the roof, he'll stop his hammering long enough to yell down for Rembrandts and Tim Tams. Best always do what your grandfather says. Don't come back from the hardware store without them, even if not one soul, not clerk or handyman or contractor, knows what the hell he sent you to buy. Not a family for quiet things. The silent consonants were varmint traps. Bad mail barfed up with ptomaine poisoning. Running hot and cold with a full-on case of the walking pneumonia you'll about never recover from. It's like that snotty bee in Subtlety, that sorority chick, her tennis skirt, the white snake of her ponytail hissing back and forth to remind you. You'll always lose the game, and despite it all, your daddy's money never was good enough. He never could get us in the club. So rarely won for heirs, we swung the racket like a bat, aimed the ball for the familiar hills to answer her playing. Then fuck subtle. And that's spelled S-U-T-T-L-E. Jessica and I were in the cemetery the other day, and we saw on one of the headstones a last name of Subtle. And Jessica said, look, there we are. This is Fanny Linguistics Publix Hieroglyphics. And Publix is a grocery store chain down in South Florida, where she spent the last years of her life. And the thing you need to know about my grandmother is that she never quite learned to read and write. Fanny Linguistics Publix Hieroglyphics. Most of the day meant a trip to the grocery, which called for a special skill, reading Fanny's grocery list. A pile of dots could be peas, hominy, or pintos, and with a cylinder next to it, add a can of. A cylinder alone was toilet paper, and drawn bigger meant paper towel. She drew tiny boxes, tiny bags, tiny cups. She drew icons of bread, chicken, beef, motion lines of sliced, quartered, ground. Once we knew a tangle of squiggles was spaghetti. We were sure. But even then, with years of experience, best not get too cocky. When we got home, she asked what the hell we bought all that nasty ass pasta for. Well, son of a bitch, she said. Look at that list I done gave you. See, look here, that's no spaghetti. Can't you read? That's sauerkraut. And this is the last one of the series called Fanny Linguistics Origins. If I asked about her education, she'd say, you mean schooling? Well, mostly a wooden chair. Ladder-backed, straight, raw wood, small, hard, hand-hewn, pegged together with no glue, no nails. She'd say, I'd pull my wooden chair up to my daddy's wooden chair. I'd ask him how to spell, and he'd help me spell until he said, Francis Lee, it's time for bed now. And I'd say, all right, Daddy. And I pushed my little chair up under the dark table and did like he said. And I'm going to read just one more poem from this book. But before I do, I just want to say that by returning to the mother tongue, by returning to the language that I knew as a child is what eventually allowed me to write the poems that I needed to write. And for those of you who are teaching your students either to speak standardized English or to write it, who are teaching English as a second language, encouraging your students to learn and to stretch, but also hold on to who they are, I think is a really important thing. And if I would have had a teacher do that for me, I could have saved myself a lot of suffering. This last poem, I'll just apologize ahead of time. It's called Fuck. And once again, this is wrestling with how she talked. Fuck is what she said, but what mattered was the tone. Not a drive-by spondy and never the fricative connotation as verb, but from her mouth, voweled, often preceded by well, with the U low as if dipping up homemade ice cream, waiting to be served last so she scooped the fruit from the bottom where all the good stuff had settled down. Imagine, not a word cold-cocked or screwed to the wall, but something almost resigned. A sigh, an oh well, the F word made so fat and slow it was basset hound, chunky, with an extra syllable, just enough weight to make a jab to the ribs, more of a shoulder shrug. Think of what's done to shit in the South. This is shit, but flipped with a whip, made a little more tart. Well, fuck, Betty Sue. I never did see that coming. Can you believe? Or my favorite, not as explicative, but noun. Fucker, she said. But what she meant was darlin', sugar pie, sweet beets, a curse word made into a term of endearment, as in, come here, you little fucker, and give your grandma a kiss. If the child was young enough for diapers, he'd still be a shit ass, but big enough to lift his arms and touch his hands together over his toddling toe head. He was so big, all grown, a cute little fucker. Watch him go. Fuck is what she said, but what she needed was a drum, a percussion to beat story into song, a chisel to tap honey from the meanest rock. Not just fuck if I know, or fuck me running, or fuck me sideways, or beats the fuck out of me, but said tender, knowing there was only one thing in this whole world you needed to hear most. You fucker, you, don't you know there wasn't a day when you weren't loved? If you still don't understand, try this. A woman up from poor soil, bad dirt, pure clay. A woman as succulent, something used to precious little water, hard sun, rock crop maybe, threading roots to suck nutrients from the nothing of gravel, the nothing of stone, a thriving thing, sturdy, thorned, green out of mere spite. And because you least expect it, laughing, cussing up a storm. My grandmother who didn't ask for power, but took it in bright, full, fuck it all, bloom. So I'm going to read one more poem just to transfer over to the new stuff. So when I started writing the book that y'all have read in common, To Those Who Were Our First Gods, I thought in my mind that I had written enough about my family, that I had turned back enough. My first book is to my sister, my second to my grandmother, and I thought, okay, Nicole Brown, like you gotta quit it now. You gotta move on. And I decided I wanted to write about animals, and I started to do that. But what was interesting to me was that I found that I couldn't access those poems once again without that core of who I was, without looking to where I came from. And I'm just going to read one poem from this, and then we'll open it up for questions in the middle. Yeah. This is called Wild Thing. What I knew then was plastic packages of ramen, instant, for $1, because with 4 eggs to match, I'd have myself 4 dinners, provided I could keep the gas on for the month and get that old stove lit with a match. I also knew what went at the store for $1. Pinto beans and sliced white, popcorn, carrots, peas, even juice, long as it was frozen, orange, concentrated in a can. But what I didn't yet know was how that word, buck, got started. Back with my daddy's daddy, and on back down the line, back when for their roomy knees, men used panther oil, brought all the way up from Florida when panthers still lived down there. Back when men without a dime to their name could pay land taxes and skins and piled as many kills they could on a wagon headed downtown to sell deer for just that, for $1, $1 a pop. No, what I knew then were bucks in my tip jar. How never to start the night empty, but to always put in a few of my own. Otherwise, not a soul would think me worth $1 and would trash the whole shift with the rattle of pocket change. And though I couldn't have said when deer season hit, no one had to tell me about the weather it brought. How cardboard crammed between wind-rattled panes helped, but barely enough. How under every cover I owned, I'd sleep until the floor stung my feet awake with cold. Once I got up and turned over my car, I might just make it to work on time, but not until I got stuck at a red light with a man who split his 2 fingers apart to make a V for the snake flick of his fat tongue, which meant something about a good time, before he gunned his truck and gave me the full view of what his flatbed towed. A white-tailed doe, one eye open, but somehow more milk or smoke or dirty dishwater than I, her tongue off its hinge, flopping obscene with every bump down that road. On my popping speakers, a new version of that same old song. Now you don't need that money when you look like that, do you, honey? And it was then I knew the bullshit made up for the endless litany to hit these woods, all those floods that scrubbed the babes from their burrows, lifting their pink writhing to a flotsam of rot, or else a rage of flames to crowd those same holes with natural-born enemies, snakes huddled alongside a scorched blister of mice and turtles nearly cooked in their own shells, and everybody saying wild things could care for themselves and always knew what to do, how to seek higher ground and survive. But really, believing that made me into just another fool in this world, mistaking the happiness of looking at a pretty wild thing with the happiness that thing feels. Put another way, I was once young and terribly pretty and gripped the wheel white, felt the rip in the vinyl seat, rubbed the part of my leg raw where my skirt didn't cover. I shut off my radio. In the silence was the talk of men I'd heard all my life, the bumper stickers that read, "Show me your rack," or "Chasing white tail," all the old jokes. That buck not dead, but put down for his dirt nap and itching for a mount. That doe not female, but a slick head, hot and ready for the rut. All those not shot, but taken in peak season in sweet, sweet November. Put another way, I was almost on empty, and though no one believed it or cared to see, I was just another animal, and like all animals desired, we would suffer.
So, Misha, would you like us to pause or keep reading? And pause for questions?
Well, let me see, look around the room. If there's this little thing down below and it's a reaction, and you can do that and you can do this. So if you have a question, I could see it if I see your, oh, look, I see Meredith just applauding. If you have a question, by all means, unmute yourself or let us know in the chat. And we'll just take a minute because there's so much to take in and curse about right now.
Sorry, y'all.
And welcome to Edgar and Ayça, maybe from Turkey, I'm not sure. And others of you who are just joining us. Oh, thanks. So does anyone have any question? I saw that Joel was asking about the photos that Jessica took and where they were from.
It seems not related to the poetry, but I promise it is. I've spent a lot of time in those southwestern deserts, and I know that isolation. Where was that cabin?
It was probably about 40 miles into the desert past, like in Abiquiu, about 25 miles past downtown, which is in between Taos and Santa Fe. So if you know Ghost Ranch, that's kind of the closest landmark. Yeah, it's beautiful, but intense.
Very, very much so. That is an excellent place for introspection and for isolation, to put it all away, for sure.
Oh yeah, whether you want it or not, I don't think you have a choice out there.
Amelia.
Thank you both for those wonderful poems. And I thought it was really interesting. You both made a reference to the fact that to write a poem, you have to have these like embodied experiences to draw from. So Jessica, you talked about, well, I had to go to the desert. And I know, Nicole, in your book, you said, you know, you were going to animal sanctuaries in the zoo. But then there also seems to be an element of imagination. And, you know, Jessica, you shared the poem where you're imagining, you know, being on this date on Coney Island. I just was wondering, how do you navigate that, where, of course, we need to have these embodied experiences to draw from, but then we're also wanting to kind of imagine and create new worlds and new places. And so I don't know if that's a question. Is that enough to go off of?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jessica and I talk all the time. A lot of times when you sit down to write, if you're writing, say, from the shoulders up, right, the writing tends to be unembodied, disembodied, floating out there in the ether, and it's full of abstractions and emotions, and it is literally untethered to what you know. In talking about an embodied experience, it's about stepping into the world and smelling stuff, right? I couldn't write about animals until I started shoveling poo, let's be honest. And I'm like, oh yeah, right? But smelling stuff, touching things, listening to the sounds around you, really using all of your senses, your catalog of senses, to bring the experience in. Because when I say to you, oh, you know, I really love animals, and you know, I don't want anything bad to happen to them. I don't want them to die. Most people will be like, okay, right? And especially if they've never spent time with them, they really dismiss it, you know. But what you have to do, whatever that is, whether you're writing about your grandmother or someone that, you know, you're in love with, or you name it, you bring in as much really, really specific information as you possibly can. And that's what will actually make the transference happen. You know, will make the inside of me talk to the inside of you, because you have a body. You might not experience any of the same things. You might have been to the same things, but you have a body that operates in a really similar way.
Yeah, and I would just to add to that, I mean, I think when Nicole talks about, like, you know, if you're talking about an idea is abstract. It doesn't have any inherent sensory qualities. So when you say something like save the animals, or I want you to feel what it feels like to be in love, it kind of just like evaporates into the air. And so I think when you go out and you write something embodied with concrete details, it puts a container around that. So Marianne Moore, the poet, said that poetry was imaginary gardens with real toads in it. I'm going to actually, I'd like to flip that on its head and say it's real gardens with imaginary toads. And the toads could either be your idea or the action that you're trying to like remember in the past. But I think it needs to be grounded in the real world.
And even if it's imagined, to ground it in sensory reality that you have in your memory. You know, I mean, I think in that Coney Island poem, you know, you've been there, right? And I mean, not in 1917, not in 1917, but you know, you know the area, and that's why you went out to the desert to write about O'Keeffe, because you had to have the desert in your body in order to write about it.
And to find her voice, I needed to understand, Joel, like what you're talking about, like what does that type of solitude really feel like? Because I was trying to find my way into her voice, and I needed that experience.
Yeah.
Nicole, have you ever, has anyone ever said to, maybe, I guess I'm just going to say, has anyone ever been offended that you're using Southern dialect? Like how do you navigate the status and the like?
I mean, I think that the thing about dialect is this. First of all, if you're going to write in dialect, it has to be a language that you really know, right? So if you're writing in the voice of characters and you don't actually speak that dialect, you better be really, really careful. But more importantly, and I think of this in terms of everything that I write in one way or another, even if I'm writing about somebody I really dislike, and that is, you write from a place of deep love and deep respect. So with my grandmother, I wanted to make absolutely sure that she was never a characterized, a caricature on the page, right? That I wasn't making fun of her. Even though a lot of it is funny, I'm not picking on her. If anything, I'm trying to record how she spoke and trying to make a record of the way that she spoke. And I don't know if I've ever offended anybody. I mean, maybe, you know, I mean, I've seen
a couple of moms who've taken their kids out of the room.
I have seen some like, come on, let's go. But you know, and if you'll notice what's so interesting, my grandmother, she cussed up a storm, but she never, as she said, I never talk nasty. Right? And even though she would drop an F-bomb every couple minutes, you would never hear it as a verb, which is really interesting. But yeah. So, I mean, I think that, and I did study intensely just to make sure that the way that the dialect was written on the page didn't unnecessarily represent the dialect to make it unreadable, or once again, to make it comic, because that wasn't my intention. My intention was to express the music of her speech and her choice of vocabulary, but not to poke fun at her ever.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm seeing some thumbs up from Meredith and Shani. Did either of you have a question, or Becca? Just
I did, but I don't want to usurp either.
go.
The question comes kind of, so it's funny, it's a great segue, because it's like Joel asked a question and my question kind of relates to Joel as well. He's written a couple of poems in this course that are related to his grandfather, or, well, we don't know if they're real people yet. He hasn't told us, but they've all been male characters. Joel is very mysterious. He's probably smiling, but he's hidden in my grid view. And so they've been male characters, and then obviously Fanny is a woman. And my question is, when you're looking at, embodying these characters and kind of grounding, do you think or has your experience been, I guess, do you think we lean towards kind of characters in our life that are like, do you think women lean toward women characters? Do you think men lead toward kind of like men role models? Do you see any consistency in your life? Because you're making me reflect on my own grandmother and my own mother, and I go like, oh yeah, I completely go female characters in my life first. Oh yeah, the men.
Yeah.
And I wonder, in that emotional expression, if there's a connection between sort of like gendered authors and the people who have influenced them. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Well, I mean, I think, gender is such a fluid and interesting thing, right? First of all, for me, I come from such a matriarchy. I mean, and I mean that in like in every way, that I couldn't help it when, I wrote my first book. Every poem talks to my little sister, because that was the only way I could write it, was to talk to her. Every poem reaches back. I find myself constantly, and I think some of this had to do with the fact of the voicelessness I had as a young girl, and as many of the young women and girls have, is like, and when I found poetry, I thought, a voice. So I guess in that way, it was kind of a feminist act. But I do have some poems that investigate male lives. I have one about my grandfather. And it is harder, because it's a world that I had been shut out of. But I don't know. But it's important too to remember, like, I'm not writing fiction. I'm always writing from my own life. I think if I were a novelist, it would be a really important question for me. So what about you, Jess?
I think like it was interesting for me with writing the book about O'Keeffe. It was definitely easier for me to find my way into her voice, because I think what I figured out about halfway through the book was what I was really trying to figure out is, what does it mean to be an artist? What does it mean to be a woman and an artist? And I do have some poems in Stieglitz's voice, and those are hard, mostly just because I came to really dislike him by reading about 1,000 pages of their letters. He's a difficult character. But I would say, like, especially in the more personal work that I'm writing now, I see a lot of my mom in me, and I really have learned a lot from her. But I actually, in my new book, like in one poem, I think I refer to myself as my father's shadow son. He has 3 girls. And as the athlete in the family, we would go running together and play basketball together. And I think we understood the world through our bodies in a similar way. And so I think it's really valuable to try to enter into other people's experiences, just as a human and in terms of empathy, but also as a writer. So like right now I'm working on poems that arise from stories in the Torah. So I have to think about, like, What was it like for Abraham to bind his son Isaac up on that mountain? And what was it like for Isaac to be bound by his father? Right? And I have to try to enter into that very, very masculine world of that time, which has been fascinating. And I've learned a lot.
Would you like to use that as a segue to read your second set, you think? Oh,
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah, okay, here. Thank you.
Okay. Misha, how much time do we have?
I am unaware.
Till 6:30, is that?
6:30, yes. So
Okay, and do you want us to leave time for questions?
I think so, if possible.
Okay.
There's a couple brewing, so that'd be great.
Okay, awesome. So as I said, this is not from a published book, but I'm working on a series of poems arising from the Torah, and I was raised in a very secular Jewish household, and it's something that I really ran away from at a pretty young age. And I think that along with that time alone in the desert, which really just opened up a space for questions, to be honest, like falling in love did the same thing, just to care about someone that deeply, and then to also have the deep fear that comes with loving something outside of yourself like that. I found all of these questions, and normally I would go to literature, and literature just was falling short for me. And for whatever reason, I think like Nicole said about, finding her mother tongue, I turned back to these ancient Hebrew texts, and they felt right to me. And then what I found was around it, there's this incredible collection of something called Midrash, which is traditionally rabbinic writings over, centuries, continents, and it's all of these brilliant people talking about these stories, interpreting them, adding their own stories around them, and they're in conversation. And so to me, as a writer, I wanted to enter into that conversation. And that's really what I'm trying to do with these new poems. And a lot of them actually deal with language. So I will try to read some of those. So this one of the things I noticed when reading the Torah, which in the Christian world is the Old Testament, is that one of the most miraculous things was that women who were barren, that was the term that's used again and again, the miracle is that suddenly their womb is filled with life. And that was like the most incredible thing that you could ask for from God. And I think it's incredible. I have two beautiful nephews, but as someone who has really grappled with this choice and made a conscious choice not to have children, I wanted to sit with that and trouble it a little bit. And so I picked, this poem is in the form of a ghazal, which is couplets where the last word in the couplet repeats, or in my case, I kind of play with the last word in the couplet, and it felt like a really good form to mull something over when it comes up again and again. So the title is a quote from Isaiah. Sing, O barren one, who did not bear a child. And I should just say that Sarah, Abraham's wife, had three names, Sarai, Sarah, and Iscah. So they'll be mentioned here. Her hand sharp in the small of Hagar's back, Sarai, that barren punster, pimped her handmaid to her husband, saying, though I am barren, I shall have a son now, Benah in Hebrew, through her. By literally saying, I shall be built up, Bana, through her. A barren woman can still be clever, though rabbis tea-leaved this to imply a childless woman is a ruined structure in need of rebuilding. Barren, however, was not a ruin forced on us, but a path my wife and I have chosen. A choice not so much against a child as for other things, our art, each other. A life barren only of all we'll never know. God said, I'll call you by a different name, and your destiny shall change. Sarai, barren, had no children, but Sarah did. Mom is a name I've cried times beyond counting, yet is a name I'll never be called. Less a name than a state of being, once born innate as DNA. Wife or writer, though, Our titles non-familial, vocational, requiring daily upkeep, a renewal of, yes, I will still bear this and be stronger for it. Who can say? Perhaps we'll end up most defined by what we are not, yet bared by the roof of our ruined structure, we count the countless stars, grow our shared life in place of bearing a new one. Because before Sarah and even before Sarai was the first of the three names she'd eventually bear, Iska, whose root might be Sakta, Sa, which would make her sight a prophet's, divinely inspired, or is Sokin, a duller lot, meaning all gazed upon her beauty. Barren, Iska, precursor to the name Jessica, like all women, torn between being a seer and being the one seen. So, prophet, tell me, is the only happy ending really a baby? So one of my big questions, just because I wasn't really raised going to synagogue, was how to pray. People say it all the time, thoughts and prayers, all that stuff, and it just seems like a mystery. And then I realized that for me, the closest that I think I feel to prayer is when I am, out on a trail run, and I can feel things, and I have those like bodily experiences. So this is my best guess. How to pray. Forget ecstasy, that easy leap outside the body. Our bodies are already up on blocks, listing and unsightly in the yard. No, the way to God is not around the world, but through it. So dig your heels into your heels, flex your fists, your jaw. Then release to become for an instant all ear. Listen out, listen up to branch sawing branch like a giant violin. Listen in. There's your blood steady loop the loop. Cue eyes, a seizure of light through the leaves. And tongue, flick of iron from a nicked gum, and you're 5 again. Last little tooth on its last little strand, wagging with your breath like a swing. Now, nose. Breathe in the dirt, astir as it is with beetles and rot and light-seeking shoots. And finally, be all skin. Like a kid's face squashed to an aquarium window, presence up so hard to the edge of your husk, you're joined with the wind rivering the cool air to silk. Only then should you give yourself to joy. Dive from the twin heights of your eyes. And that tiny pool below, the one you're hurtling toward, it's not God. Well, not exactly. It's you. One breath deeper than you've ever been. One breath closer to the heated, heatful world. Do you want to go? Or? Okay, I'm going to just again give it over to Nicole. So here you go.
Oh, she dropped my mic, literally. Okay. So Meredith had asked me about gender and asked us about gender. And so I was sitting here thinking about how to respond to that. And one of the things I think is so damaging about the human animal is the disparity between the stereotypes and pressures that we put on both sexes. And that's what this poem addresses. It actually came out of a time when Jessica was reading the Torah in bed, no less, right before we went to sleep. And I was like, you just can't do that anymore. Those stories are too scary. But she said, when was the last time you really looked at the book of Judges? And I said, well, it's been a really long time. And she said, there's a lot of animals in it. You should read it again. So I revisited the story of Samson, and that was how I wrote this poem, which ended up being, of course, the title of my chapbook that you read. It's called "To Those Who Were Our First Gods," an offering, and it's in 4 parts. Samson, I admit it. I flirted with you in Sunday school. Crayon tan, your He-Man pecs, picked the boxes best to dye bright your Pantene perfect waves. But even then, I didn't touch those 2 kamikaze columns, left blank those stone pillars snapped with your sledgehammer fist to crush a whole damn crowd. Yes, even then, I was a real red-letter girl, timid in the back pew, hiding behind the blue cloak of the only one I ever felt safe enough to pray to. Hail Mary, keep me from judges and every other book in the OT gut piled and slick as the slaughterhouse floor. Dear Mary, Mother of, save me from those men like him who slit the throats of lambs, then struck a pyre to burn the poor beast, calling what they've done a sacrifice. Even now, I'm trying to understand those jacked up swaths of the Bible everyone shoves under the rug, like your barbarian move to snag 300 fox and bind them in terrified pairs. And then, if that wasn't enough, you roped a lit torch between their tails, Samson, then freed them screaming to burn grain fields and olive groves to burn alive. Samson, did I ever tell you after hearing that story of yours, my cousin bolted out of church to try to shove firecrackers up the poodle's ass? When I cried, my aunt called from the dog from the yard, said, "Don't mind them boys, they're just proving themselves." The only boy I knew back then with nothing to prove lived down the street, and in the sleeve of his jean jacket, he kept a foundling squirrel, nursed it pan-warm milk with a syringe. That little boy's name was Pete, but everyone called him Faggot. So tell me, Samson, that donkey's jaw, did you ever think it wrong to wield a thing accustomed to the piece of fresh hay and swing it like a thug does a baseball bat? And is it really a miracle to pry open the proud mouth of a lion and rip apart his face? And why, a year later, did you return to the scene just to toy with the trophy of his corpse? Either way, you pillaged the hive that made sanctuary in what was left of his chest. I see you there, Samson, squatting inside the broken cage of ribs, reaching to where the great cat's heart used to be, snatching another stinging comb, the crust of dead bees and their honey in your beard. Because you didn't just spring hot from the mouth of wrath to slay the enemy of your tribe, did you? No, Samson, you came to kill those beasts who were our first gods. Those forms we used to paint on cave walls, those animals who were not made as sacrifice for your altars, but were the temples themselves. Come here, big man. It is time you wake. It is time you find a different answer, time to solve your own riddle once again. Out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet. Because the answer is no longer fear curdled into rage, a murdered lion with a swarm sugaring his remains. Answer me, because I see you, you action figure lackey, you lonely tender heart duped by your girlfriend's shears. I wait next to your sleeping head to gather what she cuts from you, and outside I set it free. Can you say it? Do you see? Your hair, spun with spider silk and lichen to make a hummingbird's thumbnail home. Your hair mattered into the tatters of chewed through clothes to cradle a litter naked and pink. Your hair tucked into musky dens, a spun gold currency flown among crows. Your hair, the soft bed where strays bleed and possums piss. Your hair lining every hollow, warming the throne of owls. You see, Samson, a whole kingdom steals away your locks by tooth and talon and claw. Your strength taken from you, but given back to whom it rightfully belongs. Should we stop there for questions, you think? Thank you. Here you go.
I see a question in the sidebar for Jessica. That was amazing. I mean, I'm just like, wow, that's Midrash right there. I don't know if Samson's in the Torah or I don't even know.
He's in the Torah.
Okay. So then, wow, holy cow. So I'm just catching up on, while I catch up on a question on the side, I know that I missed a question from Becca before. Becca, would you like to jump in or, yeah?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I was just thinking about how, like, I'm an athlete and I really love hearing about how other athletes train and their training community and how they become their best. So I'm just wondering about you as poets, like, what is your training process? Or like, how you have each other? Are you your own writing community or do you have a separate one? Or like, how do you become your best as a poet?
I mean, we kind of joke that if you find a really good reader, marry them. But in our case, we did that. It's kind of amazing to have like an in-house reader, in-house editor. So we're each other's first readers.
And it is in our vows.
It is in our vows.
Yeah.
That is true.
That we will be each other's first reader and witness. Right?
And it's deeply helpful to have someone who not just knows your tics and your tendencies, but also who can call you out where they're like, okay, I know you can go deeper with this. I know that you're, like you haven't pushed this hard enough.
Or I know you're afraid to say this thing that we talked about and it's here in this poem, but you're not saying it.
Yes.
Yeah, we've done that a few times.
And then we also are lucky enough to have a local writing group. There's some amazing poets in Asheville. And then we each have correspondences with poets. So, if there's someone you really admire, like reach out to them. You never know, what type of relationship can develop from that. And it's immensely valuable to have those voices too.
Mm-hmm.
You want to add?
No, I think that's great.
Any other questions? I think this was just a comment from Aisha about the paintings, George O'Keeffe's paintings, and how remarkable and exceptional her work was. And maybe, I guess that's a question of, what drew you, Jessica, to O'Keeffe, who I kind of think of in some ways as one of the most well-known female painters in America.
Yeah, I think she's one of the most well-known, but I think she's so well-known that she's kind of like Muzak. Like you don't really see that, like, they're on every dorm room at this point. And I went to grad school in Indiana, and I saw the painting Pelvis with Distance, which it's not very large. And something about that title and the painting itself was just so evocative for me that I stood in front of it and wrote the title poem of my book, which is not something I normally do. And I think, like I was saying earlier, I just realized, I had left Manhattan, like a publishing job in Manhattan, to go to graduate school and be a poet, which was totally insane. And I think that I just found this kindred spirit who had lived before me and who had forged a path in a time where it was much more difficult for women than it was, for me. And I wanted to understand how she did it, how she found that strength, and where she found the inspiration for her paintings. So almost every poem in her voice actually arises from either one of her paintings or one of Stieglitz's photographs.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Oh, you're muted, Misha.
Question from Carrie, who can wave into her box or screen if she likes, about advice for, like Nicole, you'd said that you wish you'd found some validation for dialect early in your life. Have you ever, either of you, worked with young writers or children, and what do you advise for teachers to bring into their classrooms to inspire a love of their, the young themselves and their language?
I mean, one of the benefits of this time, and there's not many, but there are some, is that this fall, Jessica and I will be teaching the children in our family poetry, because, my sisters are all homeschooling, and we've got all these little nieces and nephews. So we're really looking forward to that. But and I'm going to misquote this. I think it was William Stafford who said, when people ask him, when did you become a poet? His reply was, no, well, when did you stop becoming, when did you stop being a poet? Because children are naturals. I mean, anytime I have sat down with young writers and you just allow their imaginations to open and you validate that imagination, the same way, like if somebody would have validated the way that I spoke as a child, I would have been proud of it. Versus when kids say these crazy things, and they're pulling together all these insane questions, and they're so deeply embodied. Everything is new to them. You don't have to like fight and work to make the world new again, because it's still new to them. And I think validating that is incredibly important.
And I think especially if you're coming to this from a more formal teaching perspective, it's really vital to not make poetry into solving math equations. Here's a poem, what does it mean? What does it equal? Because that's when you talk to most young writers, that's the thing. They had a teacher who did that, and it terrified them because they were always going to get it wrong. So it's welcoming so many different ways of reading, and it's also allowing them to play, like saying, okay, what made you laugh in this poem? What made you feel sad? Okay, what makes you, and kind of like allowing them to be in conversation with these other writers, which also goes back to Becca's question, is how do you have a writing community? How do you train? And the best way, I think, for writers of all ages is reading things that make you want to stop reading and write.
Yeah. Well, and we had great fun. We have two friends. They're both poets, and they have a young daughter who memorized Jabberwocky.
Yes.
And sat on Jessica's lap, and the idea of what they call milk tongue, like when your mouth is still in love with music, and loves, and she, gosh, how old was Simone? Like
7.
When she did that, then was she 7? Yeah, it was so sweet. But
great. We have a couple of more questions, just 2 right now that I see, but by all means pop in and we'll try to get to them. But one is from Wei, and he's asking about the research that you did, Nicole, into and like what research did you do to study animals other than just be with them, and maybe some of the inquiry that Jessica did, because I don't think people think of poetry as being something you research, but can you tell us a little bit about your process?
Well, if we're in Jessica's office right now, if I would carry the computer over, you will see my whack-a-mole office across the way, which is full. And I'm so glad I was not divorced during this time, because I bought several hundred books about animals. And because I knew, but before I had always written from my own personal experience, so all I needed to do was just draw on my memory, and really, think deeply on that, my memory, my body. But when writing about animals, I didn't want to get it wrong, and so I started reading, and I still am reading. And it's funny, this book, the chapbook is the first result of this, and then I wrote a book called The Donkey Elegies. But the full-length collection is taking me a really long time, because my learning curve is so steep, and I'm realizing that the more I learn about biology and zoology and anthrozoology, which is that relationship that I'm really interested in between the human animal and animals, the more I learn about it, the more I realize I need to learn. And I'm taking my time with it, and just reading everything I can get my hands on. I'm taking classes. I'm also teaching what it is that I want to learn, which I think is really important. I don't know if you've ever set yourself up like that, Misha, where you're like, I want to figure that out, so I'll teach a class. And you are immersed in research too.
Yeah, and because I think my research process is somewhat similar, whether it was for the poems I'm writing right now, and I'm reading the Torah and Jewish scholars, I'm very slowly learning biblical Hebrew. But with O'Keeffe, I read not just her biographies, I read the biographies and memoirs of her contemporaries, as well as, thousands of pages of her letters. But to me, the real question then is, what do you do with that research? And how do you avoid writing a report as opposed to making art out of it? And I think I saw a question about that, like how can you incorporate the social sciences and all of that into poetry? For me, the way that I found was to put my notes away. So to deeply immerse myself in a topic. And what I would do is a lot of times the night before I wanted to write, I would read over all of my notes so they were fresh. I'd go to sleep, I'd wake up, I'd go for a run, and then I would sit down to write, and I would just trust that the most vital things would kind of bubble up. But then I didn't have that like straitjacket of facts.
So important.
That deadened my voice. It allowed me to use my imagination to make leaps. And then if I had a question, if I didn't understand, I just underline it. And when I'm done, I could look it up later, which is also important. We try to turn our Wi-Fi off when we're writing and put our phones on a different floor of our house. So if you can do that, it's helpful.
And I also think it's important to mention that both of us have people who are more knowledgeable about the topics that we're turning to. Elizabeth Bradfield is a poet and naturalist that I admire greatly. I've written more than one poem where I'm like, Liz, I'm not publishing this until you sign off on it. And sure enough, she'll write back and say like, well, you came close to naming the part of the whale, but I think you got that wrong. You have a rabbi you're working with. And just to get that extra bit of feedback. So it's not just other poets that we're reaching out to, but we're reaching out to,
the experts.
So there's just one last question, and it's about the connection to the self and the extraction of the self. And this is related to what I think you're talking about already. Question from Joel about when do you try to pull yourself out, and when do you purposely intentionally allow the self to be in the world of your poems?
As a corollary to that, before you dive in, you had mentioned that you'd felt at one point like you'd written enough about yourself and about your stuff, and you tried to step away from that. To what degree was that fruitful? Because you'd mentioned that you couldn't get yourself out of your poetry. Is there value in extracting yourself from it?
I think that there's always value in empathy. And there's always value in trying to bridge the divide between the self and the other, even if the poem is entirely about yourself. I would say especially if the poem is entirely about yourself. One of the things that I return to a lot is something that I keep written on the wall in front of my desk, and it's no villains, no victims. No villains, no victims. Constantly returning to that, so that there is an extraction of self that has to happen to make that work. And it's a tricky balance, right? Because we're always reaching out to the world to say, you know what, this isn't all about me. It never has been. And what can I take what's been given to me and make sense of it? And I don't know. I mean, do you feel the same way, Jessie, or do you?
I mean, I feel like in every project that I'm working on, there'll come a moment when I'm so deep in the material that I can write something. I mean, you're present in everything that you write, right? Because it's coming through the lens of how you see and experience the world. But I found myself writing like a truly lyric poem where the I is either a more general I or is absent entirely. But what I'm finding, the poems that most speak to people is when I am when I'm exploring something that's really hard for me to understand. And we talk a lot when we're teaching about coming to the page with a question. And when I come to the page with a real question, something I really need to know or at least get a better handle on, that is when I feel like I'm able to connect with the reader. And I think there's real value in that, because if something deeply matters to you, you can be guaranteed that there's someone else who needs to hear that and will be made to feel less alone by hearing what it is you have to say.
And I think it's interesting too, it's not, writing about the self isn't about confession as much as it is about curiosity and vulnerability. And that's a lot of times when I write a poem and it makes me really uncomfortable, that's kind of when I'm probably writing something I need to hang on to, which is, yay, me.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. What a reading. Applause, 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 applause.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you all.